Throughout corporate history, one ambition has proven more alluring to top executives than any other: a vision of immense scale, perpetual expansion, and a market so vast it appeared to transcend mathematical constraints. For the past 4 decades, this powerful aspiration has been known by one name: China. Imagine yourself as the CEO of a prominent Western corporation in the 1990s. Perhaps you head General Motors, oversee Volkswagen, or manage Siemens. From your office, you review sales data for North America and Europe, and the outlook is clear. Sales figures are flatlining, showing no upward trend. Anyone desiring a vehicle already possesses one. Similarly, households in need of a washing machine are already equipped. These markets have reached full saturation, making competition relentlessly fierce. However, your gaze then shifts to the east. You direct your focus to China, and the vista before you is utterly astonishing. You behold a nation of 1.2 billion inhabitants, finally emerging from prolonged periods of destitution and global detachment. Here, automobile ownership is rare, modern refrigerators are uncommon, and computers are virtually non-existent. The latent opportunity is immense. You quickly jot down calculations on a napkin. Should you manage to sell even a simple toothbrush to just a tenth of that enormous populace, you would achieve unimaginable wealth. Should you succeed in selling an automobile to merely 1% of that billion-plus population, your legacy would be cemented as the most accomplished CEO in history. This appeared to be capitalism's most monumental chance, akin to a contemporary gold rush, a phenomenon dwarfing the California gold rush of 1849 to the scale of a mere village raffle. Thus, vessels embarked across the vast Pacific Ocean. Executives arrived in Beijing aboard their private aircraft. Legal teams meticulously drafted numerous agreements. Manufacturing plants in Detroit and Wolfsburg were meticulously disassembled and transported halfway across the globe to Shanghai and Shenzhen. The Western world genuinely presumed they were initiating an unprecedented era of collaboration and affluence. They anticipated enormous financial gains. They held the conviction that commercial trade and capitalist principles would transform China into a Western-style nation. Yet, their assumptions were entirely mistaken. They weren't entering a treasure trove. Rather, they were stepping into an educational institution, a hub for industrial learning. And here lies the stunning revelation: they weren't the instructors in this arrangement. Instead, they served as the learning materials, the fundamental content to be examined and mastered. What these Western leaders failed to grasp, what they fundamentally overlooked, was the precise agenda of the Chinese government. Their ambition extended beyond merely seeing vehicles exit assembly lines, aircraft traverse their airspace, or iPhones fill their citizens' pockets. Their true desire was something far more profound. They sought complete knowledge of how to manufacture all these items independently. They had no intention of perpetually remaining consumers, reliant on foreign corporations for technological advancement. Their ambition was to evolve into formidable competitors, rivals capable of ultimately surpassing their former mentors. To achieve this ambitious objective, they required access to proprietary information, the blueprints and intricate engineering schematics. They sought the fundamental source code, the digital blueprint of software. They demanded the trade secrets that Western corporations had cultivated over decades of meticulous research, investing billions upon billions of dollars. Ordinarily, one cannot simply request a company's most closely guarded intellectual property. Coca-Cola doesn't readily disclose the formula for its renowned beverage. Apple certainly won't provide the source code for its iOS operating system. Such proprietary knowledge is safeguarded with greater zeal than gold within a secure vault. However, China possessed a distinct and potent advantage: leverage. They held the very commodity that Western companies craved above all else: control over their vast domestic market. Consequently, they engineered a snare, one explicitly embedded within their legal framework. This was known as the joint venture requirement. This narrative unfolds the details of what may be the most significant transfer of wealth in global history. It's not a tale of masked figures illicitly entering bank vaults under the cloak of night. Nor does it involve cybercriminals feverishly typing in darkened rooms. Instead, it's a chronicle of agreements meticulously signed in lavish corporate boardrooms by executives in expensive attire. It illustrates how the West bartered its future and its technological edge for nothing more substantial than positive quarterly financial results, intended to placate shareholders for a few months. And this all began within the automobile sector. To fully comprehend the mechanics of this intricate system, we must journey back to the late 1970s. China was just beginning to emerge from the Cultural Revolution, a turbulent era that had ravaged the nation. Its economy lay in ruins. Beijing's thoroughfares, unlike those in Western cities, were devoid of motor vehicles. Instead, they teemed with bicycles, countless flying pigeon models, cycling in immense, coordinated masses. The Chinese government recognized the urgent necessity of modernizing the entire country. They required trucks for freight transport across their immense territory, buses for intercity travel, and cars for the burgeoning elite class. Yet, a crucial challenge confronted them. They simply lacked the expertise to construct contemporary automobiles. Chinese automotive plants were operating with technology from the 1950s. They continued to produce the red flag limousine, a design fundamentally derived from an older Chrysler model. Laborers manually shaped metal panels using hammers, much like traditional blacksmiths. Engines were prone to frequent malfunctions and proved consistently unreliable. Braking systems often failed to operate correctly, posing clear safety hazards. In essence, their automotive engineering lagged the West by half a century. They might have attempted to independently develop these capabilities through iterative experimentation. However, such a path would span many decades, a luxury of time they simply didn't possess. Thus, they opted for an accelerated route, aiming to bypass those lengthy periods of developmental work. They extended an invitation to the leading Western automotive manufacturers to establish operations in China. Yet, a specific stipulation, explicitly codified within the Foreign Equity Joint Venture Law, accompanied this invitation. To manufacture vehicles in China, you were prohibited from independently constructing a factory. General Motors couldn't simply erect a GM plant, nor could Volkswagen build its own facility. Instead, you were mandated to secure a Chinese collaborator, typically a state-owned enterprise under direct government control. Together, you would then establish a new entity, termed a joint venture. And here lay the pivotal condition, the element that would ultimately prove profoundly expensive. The foreign entity was restricted to owning no more than 50% of this joint venture. You were required to hold an equivalent stake with your Chinese associate. Furthermore, as an integral component of this agreement, you were compelled to openly disclose your technology. You had to impart all your proprietary knowledge, effectively teaching your partner how to cultivate their own resources, rather than merely supplying them. When this proposal was presented to them, Western CEOs considered the terms. Their response? A dismissive shrug. They perceived the Chinese as unsophisticated and underdeveloped, convinced they could never match Western technological prowess. They believed it posed no risk to share the engineering for a 1980 Volkswagen Santana, certain that by the time the Chinese mastered its construction, Volkswagen would already be producing futuristic flying automobiles or even more cutting-edge innovations. Their overconfidence was profound, an intrinsic sense of superiority that would ultimately lead to their undoing. Let's examine Volkswagen's situation as an illustrative instance. Volkswagen stood out as the inaugural major automaker to fully commit to the Chinese market. In 1984, they formalized a significant agreement with SAIC, the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation. At that point, SAIC's production was limited to a small number of tractors and notoriously unreliable sedans that barely functioned, posing no competitive challenge to the global automotive sector. Volkswagen arrived, bringing its full complement of German engineering acumen and entirely modernized the Shanghai facility. They introduced immense metal stamping presses, advanced welding robots, and seasoned German engineers proficient in every facet of automotive production. Subsequently, they commenced manufacturing the Volkswagen Santana sedan. The Santana was a utilitarian, dependable vehicle. For a German motorist in its home country, it was frankly just an unremarkable taxi, utterly ordinary. Yet, for a Chinese driver in 1985, this automobile felt like something from a distant future. It featured operational air conditioning, a radio for entertainment, and crucially, it reliably started with every turn of the key, a seemingly minor detail that was, in fact, groundbreaking. The Santana rapidly became China's ubiquitous automobile. It served as the official police car, the predominant taxi filling the streets, and the vehicle of choice for government officials signaling their prestige. Volkswagen accrued vast sums of money from this partnership, establishing itself as the undisputed market leader in China. For an extended period, encountering a car on Shanghai's roads meant a high probability it was a Volkswagen. However, most observers overlooked a crucial detail. While Volkswagen was preoccupied tallying its profits and basking in its achievements, SAIC was meticulously documenting everything. Daily, on the factory floor, Chinese engineers observed their German counterparts. They assimilated knowledge on structuring intricate supply chains, mastering quality control protocols, and understanding manufacturing tolerances and exactitude. They would carry the engineering plans home each evening for intensive study. And given their 50% ownership stake in the joint venture, they possessed an unqualified legal entitlement to all shared information. Should Volkswagen devise an innovative engine, they were obligated to introduce it to the joint venture for collaborative use. If they created a novel transmission system, it too had to be presented to the joint venture. SAIC was, in essence, receiving a multi-billion-dollar education underwritten by Volkswagen. For approximately 2 decades, this collaborative structure appeared to benefit all parties involved adequately. Volkswagen achieved its desired financial returns, and SAIC acquired the expertise it sought. But then a transformation occurred. The apprentices began to come of age. By the early 2010s, China's strategic outlook underwent a profound alteration. The Chinese government concluded that they had acquired sufficient knowledge regarding internal combustion engines. They recognized that overcoming Germany's century-long lead and decades of specialized expertise in gasoline engine manufacturing was an improbable feat. Consequently, they adopted an ingenious strategy. They opted to fundamentally redefine the automotive landscape. Their decision was to bypass current technology and pivot directly to the next frontier, electric vehicles. The capital and know-how accumulated through the joint ventures were then channeled to bolster their indigenous automotive leaders. Enterprises such as BYD began to flourish, Geely emerged, and even SAIC itself initiated the launch of its proprietary brands. Abruptly, Western corporations observed an unsettling development. Their former collaborators were introducing their own vehicle brands, and these new models, upon their debut, struck Western engineers as disturbingly familiar. They featured identical chassis attachment points, remarkably similar suspension configurations, and nearly indistinguishable engineering specifications. Nevertheless, these new Chinese automobiles offered distinct advantages. They were considerably more affordable than their Western counterparts and, being electric, they embodied the future of mobility. Western CEOs voiced vehement objections, asserting unfair practices and the illicit appropriation of their intellectual property for competitive gain. Yet, their recourse was non-existent. The agreements had been signed years prior. The snare had been meticulously prepared, and they had stepped directly into it. Now, that trap had definitively closed. Fast forward to 2025, visiting China today reveals a stark change. Volkswagens no longer saturate the streets as they did for decades. Instead, BYD vehicles are ubiquitous. Neo models, with their elegant aesthetics, are common, as are Xpeng cars. The market penetration of foreign automakers in China is undergoing a precipitous decline, plummeting dramatically. Volkswagen now battles for survival in the very market it helped establish from scratch. They imparted the knowledge of automotive construction to the Chinese. Now, the Chinese are producing vehicles superior, quicker, and more cost-effectively than Volkswagen itself can. The situation further deteriorates for Western corporations because these Chinese-made vehicles are no longer confined to China's domestic boundaries. They are being loaded onto immense roll-on/roll-off cargo ships, capable of transporting thousands of units, and are embarking for Europe, Mexico, South America, and beyond. In Wolfsburg, Germany, Volkswagen executives now peer from their offices to witness BYD vehicles traversing German autobahns, the very highways where Volkswagen originated. It is the pinnacle of irony. The technological expertise shared in the 1980s and 90s has transformed, advanced, and returned to challenge its initial benefactors. However, the automotive sector represented merely the prologue to this narrative, a preliminary act. Considering that automobiles are, fundamentally, relatively straightforward consumer goods, what transpires when this identical strategy is applied to the core infrastructure of a contemporary nation? What unfolds when it's extended to the railway systems that transport an entire populace? This leads us to one of the most stark illustrations of what I term the copycat engine, the saga of high-speed rail. During the early 2010s, China confronted a significant challenge. Possessing one of the planet's largest land masses, its existing railway network was sluggish, deteriorating, and utterly insufficient. The nation aspired to advanced high-speed train systems, similar to Japan's Shinkansen, France's TGV, or Germany's ICE trains. Yet, once more, they lacked the foundational knowledge for their independent construction. Consequently, they issued a global tender, declaring their intent to construct the world's most extensive high-speed rail infrastructure, 12,000 meters of track spanning the country. The agreements represented billions of dollars in value. The preeminent players in the global rail industry enthusiastically vied for these contracts. Siemens from Germany expressed keen interest. Alstom from France was engaged. Kawasaki from Japan perceived a significant opening. Bombardier from Canada also participated in the bidding. All were intensely eager for the opportunity. This was heralded as the definitive contract of the era, perhaps even of a generation. However, the Chinese Ministry of Railways deployed the identical stratagem that had proven so effective in the automotive sector. To qualify for these contracts, participants were required to form a partnership with a Chinese firm, specifically either CSR or CNR, both government-controlled state-owned enterprises, and mandated to perform a complete transfer of technology. This entailed providing exhaustive blueprints for motors, detailed schematics for braking systems, and the complete source code for signaling systems crucial for collision prevention. Kawasaki executives in Japan harbored genuine apprehension about this arrangement. They were acutely aware of the perils, having observed events unfold in other sectors. Internally, they cautioned that China would appropriate the technology and ultimately transform into a direct rival. Yet, the leadership at Siemens and Alstom were in urgent pursuit of earnings. Their corporations desperately needed the business. They believed they could somehow mitigate the risks, perhaps by withholding the most critical proprietary information, keeping certain knowledge in reserve. Consequently, they finalized the agreements. Kawasaki proceeded to transfer the technology for its E2 series Shinkansen, while Siemens provided the proprietary information for its Valero high-speed train. For several years, this appeared to be a lucrative opportunity for all participants. Western companies amassed considerable profits from selling components and offering costly consulting expertise. However, away from public view, Chinese engineers were engaged in relentless efforts. They operated under an officially sanctioned government initiative named the Digestion and Reinnovation Program. The term digestion was indeed the official designation, evoking a biological process, consuming something, breaking it down in the digestive system, and then utilizing its energy and nutrients for one's own growth. They acquired the Japanese and German trains, meticulously dismantling them bolt by bolt, component by component. They conducted spectrometric analyses of the wheel's metallurgy and studied the aerodynamic properties of the nose cones in wind tunnels. Subsequently, they began to integrate and adapt various elements. A Japanese nose configuration might be paired with a German carriage. They re-engineered the software for enhanced performance, ultimately accelerating every aspect. Then, in 2010, merely a few years following the initial contract signings, China proudly presented the CRH-380A. They branded it an indigenous Chinese innovation, asserting it was solely the product of Chinese engineering ingenuity. They contended it bore no resemblance to prior foreign trains. However, upon scrutinizing this new Chinese locomotive, Kawasaki's engineers instantly identified it as their own creation. They noted the identical design decisions they had implemented, even observing the same flaws they had rectified years earlier. It was quite simply a replica, albeit a significantly improved and enhanced version, a clone on a grander scale. Then, the grim prospect that Western corporations had dreaded materialized. The Chinese government ceased all train purchases from foreign suppliers. Why procure a costly Siemens train when a Chinese alternative, 90% comparable, could be acquired for 30% less? Economically, it was illogical. Siemens, Alstom, and Kawasaki were entirely expelled from the Chinese market. They had been exploited to extract every last bit of value, like a lemon squeezed dry, and now their exhausted remains were discarded. Yet, the narrative didn't conclude there. Mirroring their approach with automobiles, China began exporting these trains. They established a formidable state-backed enterprise named CRRC, which has since become, by a considerable margin, the largest train manufacturer globally. Today, CRRC actively competes against Siemens and Alstom for contracts in cities like Boston and Chicago, as well as across Europe and Africa. They are confronting their former mentors directly, deploying the very technology they were virtually handed to undermine the companies that initially provided it. While this strategy is unsparing, its masterful execution commands a certain respect. It was a meticulously planned long-term deception, executed with astonishing patience over 2 decades. And while the railway industry underwent this digestion, the energy sector was on the cusp of experiencing a transgression far more overt and audacious. This wasn't merely about deciphering schematics or reverse engineering products. It involved corporate espionage, a literal act of theft under the cover of darkness. This is the account of American Superconductor, a company whose story genuinely echoes a cinematic spy thriller. The plot includes an embittered staff member, clandestine meetings in Austrian coffee shops, and proprietary code that was illicitly acquired and subsequently used to fuel an expanding empire. American Superconductor, or AMSC, as it's commonly known, was a Massachusetts-based advanced technology firm. They didn't produce wind turbines themselves. Rather, they engineered the core intelligence of the turbines, the intricate software and electronic management systems that precisely dictate how the turbine rotates, how its blades adjust to capture wind most effectively, and how it integrates securely with the electrical grid. This is exceptionally intricate technology, the critical ingredient that ensures optimal functionality. Their primary client was Sinovel, a dominant Chinese entity and the nation's leading wind turbine producer, which procured all its control systems from AMSC. This appeared to be a mutually beneficial and thriving partnership. AMSC shares were skyrocketing on Wall Street, making it an investor favorite. However, Sinovel aimed to reduce expenditures. They no longer wished to compensate AMSC for its costly software, aspiring instead to possess the source code outright. AMSC, however, refused to sell it. It was their most prized possession, their invaluable core asset. Therefore, Sinovel resolved to seize it. They identified a vulnerable point, an employee named Dejan Karabasevic, a Serbian engineer employed at AMSC's Austrian subsidiary. Dissatisfied with his role, he felt undervalued and inadequately compensated. Sinovel operatives subtly made contact, offering him substantial financial incentives, a fresh start, and, reportedly, even female companionship, a quintessential honey-trap scenario ripped from an espionage thriller. In 2011, Dejan Karabasevic successfully circumvented the encryption on AMSC's software. He transferred the invaluable source code to portable storage devices, then met with Sinovel agents and delivered it. Sinovel then uploaded this pilfered code directly into their wind turbines. Immediately, they ceased all orders with AMSC. Executives in Massachusetts were utterly bewildered, making repeated calls to Beijing. Sinovel completely ignored them, refusing all communication. Subsequently, AMSC began detecting an anomaly. Turbines operating in China were running a new software iteration, one that AMSC had never distributed. They dispatched investigators to physically ascend the wind towers across China. Remotely accessing the systems, they discovered their proprietary code executing on the machinery. However, it had undergone minor alterations. Copyright disclaimers had been meticulously removed. Nonetheless, the unmistakable digital traces remained, irrefutable proof. It was definitive evidence. By the time this discovery was made, however, it was irreversible. AMSC's stock value plummeted catastrophically, losing 70% in mere days. Investors abandoned the company, forcing them to dismiss half their workforce. The firm was nearly annihilated. They initiated legal action in both Chinese and American courts, ultimately securing a judgment years later. But the harm was already inflicted. Sinovel had leveraged the stolen technology to emerge as a significant global competitor, while AMSC was reduced to a mere vestige of its former self. This incident served as a critical awakening for the Western world. It demonstrated a fundamental shift in the competitive landscape. It was no longer merely a matter of tough negotiations, but rather a fight for existence. Yet, these examples merely pertain to the industrial sectors we've examined thus far: automobiles, railways, and wind energy. The true objective, the supreme reward, lay in the future of computing itself, extending to the very dominion of the skies. This brings us to the aerospace industry, dominated by the duopoly of Boeing and Airbus, the twin titans governing global aviation. For decades, they regarded themselves as utterly impregnable. Constructing a jetliner is arguably the planet's most formidable engineering undertaking, demanding millions of distinct components. The industry demands safety benchmarks that are incredibly difficult to satisfy. The prevailing belief was that China could never close this gap, but this assumption proved incorrect once more. This is where COMAC, China's commercial aircraft manufacturer, steps in. Annually, The Chinese government observed the staggering sums, billions upon billions of dollars, expended on purchasing aircraft from Boeing and Airbus. They declared this was no longer acceptable. We desire our own aircraft. Consequently, the C919 project was initiated. Its objective was transparent and bold, wouldn't you agree? China, therefore, reapplied its strategy of leveraging market access for technology transfer. They extended invitations to Western suppliers, including firms like Honeywell, General Electric, Rockwell Collins, and Parker Aerospace, to participate in the endeavor. These Western enterprises, spanning both American and European origins, specialize in manufacturing critical components such as engines, avionics, and landing gear. COMAC laid out an unambiguous condition for them. Participation in the C919 program necessitated forming a partnership with a Chinese firm. This meant establishing yet another joint venture. Honeywell's interest lay in providing the flight control system. Excellent, COMAC responded. Establish a joint venture with a factory in Xi'an. Similarly, General Electric aimed to supply the avionics. Perfect, came the reply. Form a joint venture with AVIC. The U.S. government expressed sincere apprehension. It cautioned these corporations that, in effect, they were nurturing their future rivals. However, the immense appeal of the Chinese market proved irresistible. Projections indicate that China will become the world's largest aviation market in just a few years. With trillions of dollars in prospective aircraft orders on the table, the suppliers readily inked the agreements. Today, COMAC has its own aircraft. The C919 is now airborne. It bears a striking resemblance to an Airbus and performs similarly, yet it proudly carries the Made in China label. Detractors label it a mere Frankenstein plane, an amalgamation of Western components. For the moment, this critique holds true. The engines, for instance, are still based on Franco-American blueprints. Yet, the immediate present isn't the ultimate objective. The real aim is the future, tomorrow, and the subsequent decades. With each passing year, the Chinese participants in these joint ventures are acquiring invaluable expertise. They are mastering the intricacies of jet engine construction. They are also becoming proficient in programming flight computers. This is a testament to their remarkably patient, long-term strategy. While Western nations focused on the immediate financial gains from these joint ventures, China meticulously orchestrated its pivotal move, a policy white paper that would deeply alarm policymakers in Washington and Berlin. Unveiled in 2015, it carried an unassuming title, Made in China 2025. This was far more than a mere marketing slogan or public relations initiative. Instead, it presented a comprehensive blueprint for achieving technological supremacy. The document identified 10 crucial industries where China aimed for complete self-reliance, including robotics, aerospace, new energy vehicles, semiconductors, and biomedicine. This policy served as an unequivocal global statement. The age of mere imitation had concluded. The era of genuine innovation was now underway. China no longer intended simply to assemble iPhones. It aspired to design future iPhone models independently. Their ambition extended beyond just manufacturing Nike footwear in their factories. They sought to command the brands themselves. This policy profoundly disquieted Western powers, acting as the primary instigator for the ensuing trade conflict. It directly led to the U.S. government's decision to prohibit Huawei from operating on American networks. This policy is why we now witness a technological iron curtain gradually falling worldwide. To grasp the true implications of Made in China 2025, however, we must examine China's unique innovation culture. We must consider the term Shanzhai, which once denoted fake but now signifies fast. In the early 2000s, Shanzhai described the imitation phones available in Shenzhen's electronics markets, devices like Nokia instead of Nokia or Samsung instead of Samsung. These were inexpensive fakes that deceived no one. Yet, a remarkable transformation occurred within those Shanzhai markets. The manufacturers of these phones began to innovate, incorporating features that major corporations overlooked. They included oversized batteries, as migrant workers often lacked consistent access to phone charging. They integrated 4 SIM card slots to facilitate easy carrier switching. They also added powerful speakers for music playback. Their pace of iteration surpassed even that of Apple or Samsung. This Shanzhai ethos of swift, aggressive iteration matured, giving rise to companies like DJI, the drone manufacturer. DJI originated as a small enterprise in Shenzhen, but innovated with such astonishing speed that it eliminated every American and European rival in the drone sector. Currently, DJI commands 70% of the worldwide drone market. This iterative spirit also fostered entities like TikTok, whose highly addictive algorithm captured global attention in just 3 years. Western perspectives, however, often remain fixed on the outdated notion that China is merely capable of imitation. The contemporary truth is that the erstwhile copycat has transformed into an innovator, a transformation for which the West inadvertently footed the bill. Our subsequent exploration will delve further into the semiconductor conflict, or chip war. We must examine the desperate efforts of the United States to safeguard its technological advantage by restricting the export of critical lithography machines. Furthermore, we will analyze the ramifications of this decoupling, given how thoroughly interconnected global supply chains have become, making their disentanglement potentially unfeasible. We will also investigate China's internal costs, particularly the demanding 996 work culture, a regimen of 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, which serves as the human engine fueling this entire system. While crude oil powers the world, silicon is the lifeblood of our modern era. Command over oil dictated the 20th century economy. Conversely, control over silicon will define the 21st century economy. This leads us to the ultimate challenge in this technological conflict, the semiconductor. For many years, China has relentlessly strived to develop its indigenous computer chip manufacturing capabilities. The nation's expenditure on chip imports consistently surpasses its spending on oil imports, highlighting chips as its most significant strategic weakness. Should the United States cease chip sales to China, the Chinese economy would halt entirely. Smartphones would power down, cloud servers would fail, and missiles would be grounded. In response, the Chinese government established what it terms the Big Fund, a vast financial reserve totaling many billions of dollars, aimed at constructing a self-sufficient domestic chip sector. However, a core obstacle remains. Replicating a microchip isn't as straightforward as duplicating a car. A vehicle can be reverse-engineered simply by measuring its components. A train's design can be duplicated by dissecting its metallic structure, and even a wind turbine can be reproduced with sufficient dedication. Yet, a contemporary microchip stands as humanity's most intricate creation, comprising billions of transistors, each tinier than a DNA strand. Fabricating these chips requires an exceptionally specialized device, a lithography scanner. More precisely, it demands a machine exclusively produced by ASML, a Dutch company. These scanners are monumental, comparable in size to a city bus, command a price tag of $200 million apiece, and perform what appears to be sheer alchemy. They employ lasers and molten tin to etch patterns, just a few atoms in width. China ardently desired these machines and attempted to acquire them. This, however, was where the Copycat Engine finally encountered an insurmountable barrier. The U.S. government recognized that if China obtained these devices, its technological ascent would become unstoppable. Such access would enable China to develop sophisticated artificial intelligence processors and create impenetrable encryption systems. Consequently, the United States successfully persuaded the Dutch government to prohibit the export of ASML's most advanced machines to China, effectively imposing a strategic chokehold. China reacted with intense indignation, characterizing this move as technological containment. Unable to acquire the critical machinery, they pivoted to an alternative strategy, recruiting skilled individuals. This represents the clandestine aspect of the ongoing conflict, a war for talent. China initiated programs, such as the renowned 1,000 Talents Plan, with a straightforward objective: identify and attract the world's leading scientists from institutions like NASA, Intel, and prominent universities. They were offered substantial financial incentives, access to cutting-edge laboratories, and promises of prestige and recognition to relocate to China. While some of this recruitment was entirely legitimate, instances also occurred where ethical boundaries were crossed, verging into outright theft. There are documented cases of engineers from American chip firms downloading vast quantities of proprietary files onto external drives before immediately departing on a one-way flight to Beijing. They pilfer proprietary recipes, chemical formulations for photoresists, and designs for memory controllers. However, one particular narrative serves as a stark cautionary tale, illustrating the consequences when a corporation entirely disregards such threats. This is the saga of Nortel, a Canadian technology powerhouse. Throughout the 1990s, Nortel ranked among the world's foremost tech enterprises. They were instrumental in constructing the Internet's core infrastructure, developing fiber optic networks, and pioneering early wireless data systems. At its peak, the company's valuation accounted for a third of the entire Toronto Stock Exchange. Yet, within Nortel's Ottawa headquarters, an alarming situation unfolded. Executives began to observe their microphones inexplicably activating on their own. Furthermore, unusual data transmissions were detected leaving their servers during late hours. Covert listening devices were discovered embedded in their boardrooms. The company had been subjected to a thorough and absolute cyber intrusion. The perpetrators gained unrestricted access to all corporate data, including the CEO's personal correspondence, technical documentation, strategic business plans, and intricate pricing models. The ultimate recipient of this purloined intelligence was a then-obscure company from Shenzhen, Huawei. In that period, Huawei primarily functioned as a distributor of telephone switching equipment. Abruptly, however, Huawei began manufacturing hardware identical in appearance to Nortel's, but offered at a 30% lower price point. Whenever Nortel submitted a tender for a global contract, Huawei would consistently undercut its bid by a slight margin. Huawei possessed precise knowledge of Nortel's pricing strategies even before Nortel finalized its offers. Consequently, Nortel started hemorrhaging finances, losing one contract after another, leading to a precipitous decline in its stock value. By 2009, Nortel declared bankruptcy, marking the largest corporate collapse in Canada's history. This catastrophe resulted in tens of thousands of job losses and wiped out the life savings of many pensioners. As for Nortel's Ottawa campus, it was acquired by the Canadian government. Yet, upon occupation, authorities discovered the building to be so infested with surveillance devices and spyware that it required complete demolition down to its concrete foundation and a total reconstruction. Meanwhile, Huawei strategically recruited former Nortel engineers, seized dominance in the market, and ascended to become the global leader in 5G technology. In this analogy, Nortel played the role of the host. Huawei, acting as the parasite, ultimately destroyed its host. This account profoundly alarmed Western intelligence organizations, who recognized that if Huawei constructed Europe's and America's 5G infrastructures, it would establish an enduring backdoor into all telecommunications and data transmissions. This realization culminated in what is now referred to as the Great Ban. The United States prohibited Huawei from its domestic networks and exerted pressure on its allies to follow suit. This represented the first significant instance of the West effectively countering the Copycat Engine. Nevertheless, the conflict is far from resolved, as China has undergone substantial evolution. Its activities are no longer limited to mere imitation. It is pioneering advancements in sectors that the West has largely neglected. Consider the drone, solar panel, and battery industries, for example. China now leads in these sectors, not through technological appropriation, but by mastering scalability. They understand that sheer volume inherently possesses its own form of quality. Producing millions of batteries, for instance, naturally refines manufacturing processes, reduces expenses, and uncovers efficiencies. This principle is the learning curve, and China is navigating it with unprecedented speed. However, this rapid progress comes at a price, a human cost, which may be the sole impediment to China's seemingly unstoppable momentum. The internal mechanisms of China are overheating dangerously, leading to widespread burnout among its populace. In technological centers like Shenzhen and Beijing, a pervasive 996 work culture dictates working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, a demanding 72-hour workweek. This expectation is mandatory. Failure to comply results in termination, and complaints are met with accusations of idleness. While this harsh work environment propelled the growth of companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and TikTok, generating vast fortunes for their founders, it condemned the average worker to a life of perpetual exhaustion. Chinese youth now view their futures with despondency, facing unaffordable housing markets and a ruthless education system that stifles childhood. In response, many are choosing to opt out, embracing a movement called Tangping, or lying flat. This philosophy advocates for doing the absolute minimum, abstaining from marriage, homeownership, and parenthood, and rejecting the 996 work ethic. This silent defiance deeply unnerves the Communist Party because the Copycat Engine relies on a continuous supply of fuel, inexpensive labor, ambitious engineers, and an expanding population. Yet, China's population is contracting. The legacy of the one-child policy has triggered a demographic crisis, resulting in an insufficient number of young people to replenish the aging workforce. Factories in China's southern regions are already reporting labor deficits, and wages are steadily climbing. The era of cheap China has concluded. So, what comes next? What transpires when the copycat exhausts both its sources of imitation and its available workforce? We are entering a precarious 10-year period. China is keenly aware that its opportune moment is fleeting. It understands the imperative to establish itself as a technological superpower before its demographic window closes. This awareness fuels desperation, which in turn breeds aggression. We observe this dynamic unfolding in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan manufactures 90% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors, with TSMC standing as the global economy's most prized asset. China covets this. If unable to develop these chips independently, it might attempt to acquire them by force. An invasion of Taiwan would transcend a mere territorial conflict. It would constitute an armed corporate takeover, the ultimate act of forced technology transfer. Where, then, does this situation position the West? The executives who eagerly invested in China during the 1990s are now making preparations to depart. Apple is shifting manufacturing to India, Samsung to Vietnam, and Dell is actively disentangling its supply chain from China. They are now realizing the profound error of their previous agreements. They exchanged proprietary knowledge for entry into a market that is now becoming hostile. While McDonald's golden arches still punctuate Beijing's skyline, the underlying optimism has vanished. We are transitioning from an era of globalization to one of technological decoupling. The global landscape is bifurcating into two distinct technological ecosystems, one spearheaded by the United States and the other by China. Your mobile device will operate on one version of the internet, while theirs will connect to another. Standards will diverge and microchips will vary. The Copycat Engine has successfully fulfilled its purpose. It orchestrated the transfer of Western affluence and expertise to the East, an unprecedented wealth transfer in history. Remarkably, this entire process was perfectly lawful. These agreements were triple-signed, legally sanctioned, and lauded on the covers of business publications. We had convinced ourselves that trade would foster camaraderie. We believed that China, once prosperous, would inevitably adopt our values. Instead, China became a reflection of our own avarice, leveraging our craving for inexpensive products and short-term quarterly gains to construct a formidable apparatus that now contests our global supremacy. Now, as electric vehicles overwhelm our ports and satellites traverse our firmament, we are compelled to confront a difficult question. Have we, in fact, engineered our own obsolescence? The narrative of the copycat is ultimately a chronicle of overconfidence. We harbored the conviction that we were the arbiters of the world. We presumed we could dictate the dissemination of information. However, knowledge, much like water, follows the path of least resistance. It gravitates toward where it's desired and where individuals exert greater effort to obtain it. China demonstrated a readiness to work harder, to learn diligently, to make sacrifices, and, indeed, to engage in deception. Now, the apprentice has surpassed the mentor. The period of instruction is over. The upcoming examination won't be academic, it will unfold in the tangible world, a trial of inventiveness, systemic fortitude, and adaptability. Can the intricate democracies of the West truly contend with the singular focus of Eastern autocracy? Can our capacity for invention outpace their ability to replicate? This profound question will shape the 21st century. For the copycat has ceased its imitations. It is now authoring the subsequent phase, and we may find ourselves in the position of observers, taking notes. Thank you for viewing.